take. Oh, no. Right, good morning, everyone. So I've just been speaking to the panel about introducing them. So welcome to the next panel on Betting on Sports Europe. Market forces when our bets too risky to take. My name's Scott Longley. I'm from Clear Concise Media. And I have a panel with me, Gustav Hofstad, Secretary General for the Trade Association of Best Bookmakers in Sweden, Gilles Mallet, Director of Sports Integrity at Française des Jeux, and Oliver Lamb, Head of Sportsbook Controller, Head Sportsbook Controller, should I say, at Canby. I'll let them introduce themselves briefly, say hello to everyone, and then I will get on with some questions. So, Oliver, if you wish to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, as you say, I'm Head Sportsbook Controller at Canby. So amongst other responsibilities, I look after sports integrity within the organisation, so ensuring that we're following our policies internally and also communicating externally with our key stakeholders such as regulators, the International Betting Integrity Association, and occasionally sports governing bodies.
Gilles?
Yes, as Sports Integrity Director, in fact, I have three missions, I would say. The first one is the prevention vis-à-vis the actors of sports in France, prevention of match fixing, and monitoring of competitions through monitoring of sports of bets. And last is it also influence and cooperation nationally and internationally to improve, generally speaking, the effectiveness of anti-match fixing actions.
Okay, Gustav, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Gustav Hofstedt, and I am the Secretary General of BOS, the Swedish Trade Association for Online Gambling. We, as an association, represent just above 20 gambling companies that operate in Sweden, both B2Cs and B2Bs. As you know, Sweden re-regulated its gambling market almost 2 years ago, and we represent the privately owned online operators and B2Bs that operate in Sweden today.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so let's get on to some of the questions. Obviously, this is a very important subject and sometimes a very political subject, and certainly one where I think there are a lot of viewpoints, which I think we'll be able to cover in the next 40 minutes. Let's start with some kind of questions to ground us on what we're looking at here. The question is, are there some sports that are riskier than others when it comes to corruption and match fixing? Everybody assumes that there are, but it'd be interesting to hear views on that. And secondly, within those sports, are there markets within those sports which are inherently more corruptible? Maybe if we could go first to Oliver, who might be able to help us on that first question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look at the raw data itself that comes out of integrity associations, you'll often see that tennis is top of the list. Pretty much it has been the case for the last few years. A large part of that you probably would say, I mean, it's a head-to-head sport, so I mean it only takes one person to be corrupted in the game for it to be flipped, compared to football where you might need a group of players or the referee to be involved. I'd say likewise, because it's so heavily targeted in a certain sense by match fixers, it's probably it's the fact that they have the match fixers quite strong connections, you could say, not to the tennis store itself, but they have their setup. They target tennis specifically. It's where they focus their energies. So I wouldn't say it's tennis's fault as such. I think they're just victims of being heavily targeted by these criminals compared to other sports. As I do say, that football as well it does come higher in the list as well. Largely the lower level leagues in certain countries. Again, it's linked to how much the participants are being paid. If you're not being paid a specifically high wage, then it'll be easier in a sense to corrupt you. Within those events, in the past, the larger targets were betting on the match to be fixed or a larger portion. Now you can have maybe just a single point or an occurrence in a soccer match to be manipulated. So that's the kind of the overview. Although one thing I would say was that obviously that sounds quite alarmist in a sense. It's just to be clear that this does occur in a very low proportion of events, and there's lots of controls around it. So that's kind of the high level, but it does happen, not so frequently as you may imagine in that sense.
I guess a point that's worth making, just even at this early stage, is the point is that incidences of corruption will get a lot of press and a lot of publicity, and will hint that maybe there is a wider problem underneath it, when that might not often be the case, I guess. That's a fair point, do you think?
Exactly. I mean, the subject of match fixing is absolutely fascinating. I mean, we've got a panel on it because, I mean, people like to listen in and hear about it, but the media as well will obviously report it as well. It certainly sells newspapers in that sense. I mean, quite rightly, there should be a focus on it when it does happen. But yeah, as you say, I mean, it does create a lot of media noise, whereas it doesn't happen quite so often. And hopefully we'll discuss today, I mean, the betting companies, the trade associations, the integrity organizations have got very strong controls in this area as well, to keep things at bay.
Yeah. In fact, let's get on to that in terms of what systems are in place. And Gilles, maybe you can discuss what's the situation in France and how Francis Tejeur plays its part in the anti-corruption drive.
Yes, in fact, just one comment, perhaps. I agree with what Oliver said about, of course, individual sports like tennis that are more risky. And we observe also similar trends, by the way, on table tennis and badminton, by the way. And also, it's very clear that the lower, I would say, the revenue of the sports people in general in any country, and the higher the risk is of looking at match fixing. I may not be so optimistic as Oliver about that it doesn't occur so often. In fact, personally, I'm rather glad that most of the press is not speaking too much about all the cases that happen in reality. So I think the truth is a bit in between. Yeah, it's not so public as what it could be. So there are some scandals locally that make a bit of noise. But I can take the example of France. There was a case on tennis. It was last year, 2019, when 20 French players have been subject to investigation in the frame of the international criminal network, who manipulated a lot of tennis matches at challengers and futures level. And I can tell you, hopefully, the press did not speak too much of that, and which is, I think, good news for tennis and for sports betting industry. By the way, it could be worse. In France, there is, like in today, almost 30 other countries, there is a national platform, which is an interesting model of cooperation. And this model, you have an exchange on information and very quick communication between the sports federations and leagues, law enforcement authorities and regulators of the market, and sports betting operators. And I think it's very effective system. Every time one of the members of these families that detects something or has a suspicion, it is shared with all other members, so that we can all double check, monitor the kind of information we have. And from our side, every time we detect something, or if we have something coming from our international association, which is called GLMS, and Global Lottery Monitoring System, I'm a member of the executive committee of GLMS as well. Then it is shared immediately. We share it immediately with the members of the French National. I mean, it helps a lot, I would say. And the other system is that the French market is extremely, let's say, regulated. There's a list of competitions and markets you can offer, and it is very limited. We just spoke with our Swedish colleague, with Gustav. I mean, in France, in football, you can only bet on the first two levels of leagues, which, when I compare that to many other countries, it's extremely limited. But it gives also the opportunity to in general, limit, let's say, highly the risk of fixing.
Yes, this is an interesting point, isn't it? Is that it's a question, particularly when it comes to football and to tennis in a slightly different way. It's this aspect of how far down a pyramid of sport should betting be involved in terms of what can be bet on. Gustav, in Sweden, as we were discussing just before we went live, there were moves about lower league football, for instance, during the lockdown, which obviously was an extraordinary circumstance because it was the lockdown at the time. But is there an issue with betting on leagues further down the pyramid? And does that issue, is it the same for every country? I guess is a big point. And I'll go back to Oliver as well after you've had a chat on that.
Well, Scott, we had a very particular situation this spring during the lockdown. That lower tier football teams continued to play in Sweden, but since there was a global lockdown, the kind of games that they participated in gained a lot of global interest, and referees and even parents to children received phone calls from Sydney and Hong Kong from people that wanted to bet on those games for the fact that there was almost nothing else to bet on. And obviously that created a lot of frustration in the Swedish society. As a consequence, not the only consequence, but it contributed to the decision by the SGA to prohibit betting in lower football tiers. Whether that was a wiseful decision or not can be discussed. I am less enthusiastic about prohibitions like that on a policy level. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that I believe that liquidity is what attracts corruption, and in lower levels, the liquidity is usually not that high as in higher divisions. But the main problem with prohibitions like that is that there is still a demand to bet on those lower tier divisions in Sweden. But from 1st of January next year, locally licensed operators will not be allowed to offer those bets. And you don't have to be super smart to figure out where those bets will go instead. They will, of course, be adopted by the global unlicensed market. And that is, of course, a huge problem when it comes to monitoring Swedish football. Licensed operators, we heard the example from Jill here, that licensed operators, they cooperate. And they also, of course, contact law enforcement when they detect something suspicious. I do not believe that unlicensed operators share that kind of interest to cooperate with its competitors, nor with law enforcement. And for that reason, to prohibit those bets for licensed operators is like putting needles in your eye. You will become totally blind to what happens in this case with the Swedish lower tier football.
Well, this is a problem, isn't it, Oliver? That we've got a global betting market in terms of we have pools of liquidity in Asia, pools of liquidity in Europe, and the US in particular, and yet we have obviously local leagues and local regulation of sport that doesn't necessarily match up to the global nature of the betting that's on it. I mean, in that instance that we're talking about in terms of Sweden, presumably Kambi will be still offering odds for its other customers elsewhere around the world on Swedish lower league football. And indeed, when it comes to UK football, if you had a prohibition on anything below maybe the second tier, which is what we've got in France, that would cut out a lot of betting in UK terms.
Yeah, no, and likewise, I mean, we'll know, Scott, from the UK market that, I mean, if you apply the Swedish rule, which is coming in around only betting on the top 4 divisions of any football league worldwide, there'll be certain situations like, the 5th divisions or the conference that used to be known in the UK, in the English football pyramid, is still pretty attractive from a domestic betting perspective, and it's a very competitive league as well. And likewise, I mean, if you try and put these rigid structures in place, there'll always be scenarios where you've actually tied your hands, and you've tied the hands of the licensed betting market as well. I mean, one of the rules in Sweden is that it said you can't offer not just top 4 divisions, but teams from those top 4 divisions. So if one of these lower league teams goes on and running the cup, like again we'll know in the UK and English FA Cup, you'll sometimes see a lower league team go on a big run, and they may play Manchester United in a big televised game, and the local operators can't offer that. And if you can't offer televised games, then you're in big trouble. And likewise, I mean, in France, for Gilles' perspective, I'm sure he'll know in the National League, there'll be some big teams down there in the 3rd tier and below. And local people who want to bet on their local team, they won't be able to do it in the licensed market. For many, they'll say, okay, well, I'll leave it, I won't do it. A small percentage may go and place their bets in the unlicensed market. So even though you're trying to protect the integrity of sports, you'll always be throwing up these things where maybe you're not always maybe benefiting match fixers, but you may be benefiting the unlicensed operators.
It does throw up the issue.
To say something there. I mean, it's the point is that it has to do with how the states are fighting against illegal operators, illegal bookies. And it's not because some people are driving without license and without insurance that we should simply forget about any code of conduct on the roads. So, I mean, personally, I think it's honestly it's wise to avoid betting on very lower leagues of various sports, or sometimes even higher leagues in some countries where the average salary is so poor, but then we have to fight against let's say illegal operators. This is the rule of the states, and I can testify that some states are doing that rather properly. I mean, okay, there is no country where there is zero, let's say, illegal operators, but there are cases where definitely the job is done, and where the market is mostly legal, and then you are. I think you can offer safer bets to your clients. I mean, this is also protecting your clients by not offering bets that are too risky, and the fact that it can go to illegal bookies, to me, is something that yes, that does exist, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight against that.
No, indeed. I know this is obviously a very nuanced argument, and one of the issues that I think is, I suppose, can cause some confusion is where does where does responsibility lie in this area? Because in part, this is about gambling companies and gambling operators and suppliers understanding where the weaknesses are and where the problem gambling might come from, or where there might be issues. But then it comes down to also the sports themselves in terms of what they can do to potentially educate their people or the competitors. And then you've got the gambling regulators who then make decisions based on sometimes what would seem to be political decisions. And finally, of course, you would have the police and enforcement authorities. When it comes to this kind of matrix of people that are involved here, do you think there's enough cooperation being seen across the piece? Maybe Gilles, you could comment on that.
Well, it varies from one country to another. I know quite well the French example. There is an excellent cooperation between the various members of the French national platform. The issue, as it was mentioned there, is that the sports betting market is a global market. We can bet from France to on competitions that happen anywhere else in the world. and vice versa. So what is important is to develop the cooperation between countries. So this is why I would say the international associations of operators, whether this is GLMS or ABIA, are important. And this is why also cooperation between having more national platforms is important, and cooperation between those and cooperation with Interpol, with the international federations like UEFA, FIFA, is extremely important. So because this is the only way. This cooperation will be the key for the future to me. So that's the only way to fight on a global perspective. So it's in progress, but we are far from being to the end of the work.
And Gustav, how do you feel your association sits with regard to, because you're a relatively young regulated market, and therefore your position in the market as an advocate for betting is relatively new. How do you feel you sit in the in the Swedish? You can also talk about Spain if you wish to, but how do you feel you sit in the Swedish structure?
Well, as being relatively immature in our new licensing system, I believe that there is a big room for improvement. If I look at my colleagues in the UK, I noticed that their integrity cooperation between authorities and the industry and the sports federations are more focused on collaboration. Whereas we in Sweden still fight on a policy level between stakeholders whether it is a good solution to prohibit almost everything or to allow almost everything. Hopefully we will mature in a couple of years and come closer to the integrity cooperation that we with some envy observe from the UK. Regarding the question on whether to prohibit or not, I am of course not in favor of allowing everything. That is definitely not my advocacy. There are numerous reasons to prohibit certain bets. To give you an extreme example, some bets are immoral and shall for that reason not be allowed, like animal fighting, to give you perhaps the most extreme example. But I work at a policy level, whereas my colleagues here, and well, at least Oliver Lamb, he works at an operational level. And of course, B2Cs and B2Bs, they have the responsibility to, whenever they suspect any kind of corruption, they shall of course stop that match. But at a policy level, when we talk about whether to prohibit a whole line of betting types, then I believe it's a wise decision to be generous towards the locally licensed operators. Yes, it's always a responsibility to combat unlicensed operators, but look at the numbers. Sweden now have a leakage of approximately 20% out to unlicensed operators when it comes to sports betting. Regarding unlicensed casino, it's even worse. And I believe that we must understand that repressive measures towards those unlicensed operators will never be sufficient in any jurisdiction. The key here to create a successful licensing system, and there are good examples like UK and Denmark, is that you accept the fact that licensed operators must be able to offer attractive offers to the punters. If you only try with repressive measures to the unlicensed operators, then you are bound to fail.
Yeah, I think I suppose we're getting into the territory which is where we have to be careful, which is that the elision between unlicensed bookmakers and corruption in some kind of way, which I think is often a charge made against offshore, what we broadly say could be offshore operators, and one which they unsurprisingly often rail against. But Oliver, when it comes to understanding the flows in when it comes to corruption, is it possible, do you think, that we can encourage further education on the part of, particularly in terms of sports and the people involved in sports, and understanding where gambling sits here? Because obviously for betting companies, corruption is it's never a good thing, and never has been a good thing, and it does them and their clients no good whatsoever if there are instances of it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's great that we can talk about integrity publicly like this, but ideally we wouldn't need to talk about it because it wouldn't happen in the first place, these kind of problems. And as you said, I mean, even unlicensed operators are not interested in taking bets on fixed matches. I mean, you're guaranteed to lose money in that perspective. I think the issue would be that if a bookmaker who's unlicensed took bets on a fixed match, they've got no outlet to the regulator, to the association such as the LMS, IBA, to send that information. So it can often just die there, which is the benefit of the regulation when you can escalate this kind of stuff. But no, definitely, as you said, I mean, a large part of the fight here we can bring is to educate sports people directly, and the bookmakers can help there. I know that in Sweden, Kindred have got a sponsorship deal with the local football leagues, and part of that is to educate players around not just how betting in general works, but also how corruption can seep in, what to look out for. Gilles mentioned as well that they'll have a similar role in France as well, and it's definitely good for the betting companies to have that kind of protected access in a way to the sports governing bodies, to be able to tell their side of the story of what can happen, what they can see. And it's good that sports people can understand as well from the perspective that, I mean, obviously there'd always be crime, and match fixing will always be one of those crimes that will be attempted. But quite often, or nearly always, when there is a prosecution or a sanction, it's not the match fixer or the criminal organization who is caught, it's the sports person. So they're the ones who are risking their careers for very small amounts of money, essentially. The people that profit, even if the match fixing is unveiled and uncovered, they'll just disappear into the ether, and it's the sports person who suffers and loses their career. So it's definitely important to get these kind of messages across, not to spook them, it's just to give them the reality. I mean, this is going to happen. We'll see cases every day of potential match fixing, and one day, it could be you or your team who's targeted.
Yeah, I mean, on a related issue,
I've got a related
issue here.
Yeah, I fully support this. In fact, I think the operators have a responsibility also in this educational prevention program, awareness raising. We make a lot of those. I must say, every year I think we see at least more than 800 actors of sport, professionals or future professionals, staff members, etc. And what I can point out is that very few of them are really aware of the phenomenon of the development of sports manipulations. They heard a lot about doping, but regarding manipulations, they know very little. And this is where we can really contribute, because at least we know most of the mechanics, and and they discover a lot of things. And we can first raise awareness on the issue, and second, give a very concrete pieces of advice on how to behave, what to do. Don't share inside information, don't bet, refuse, report, etc. And it's not only the role of sports organizations, because the issue that they know, in general, they know very little about the sports betting market and how it works, and how it can be badly used by criminal networks. So we have a role to play, and I think we're welcome by the sports organization. So it's a responsibility that we share. It's also defending our own business, as Oliver said. The operators are also victims of match fixers. So it's our interest to go and meet the actors of sports directly.
We're We've got a question from the audience. This is from Harrison Sayers at Gambling Compliance, who is asking, he says, what kind of wage threshold do you see for the sports to be viable, to be allowed to have bets placed on them? I guess this is more actually about prize money, isn't it? Prize money levels. I know this has come up, specifically this has come up in tennis, of course, with the International Review Panel and how they looked at ITF tennis and the levels of where the betting it takes place. And potentially where the corruption takes place. Is it possible to do that at a level of prize money? Is that something that can be? And in football, it would obviously come down to how much you're getting a weekly wage, I guess. But is that a feasible way of doing it, or do you think that introduces a layer of complication which actually would be virtually unenforceable? Maybe
I can tell that. Yeah, there's so many nuances that, as Gustav's saying, if people are going to put in place rigid structures, you're going to create scenarios which the structure can't handle. So with kind of the wage threshold, sport by sport, it can vary greatly. You've mentioned that, in ITF tennis, that they're looking at, only being able to allow betting on tournaments with a certain prize money threshold, which makes sense. But in football, soccer, some of the very interesting leagues may have quite either low pay or, particularly we're seeing in this COVID situation, some of these teams are in financial trouble. And when are we going to be know that maybe that the wage threshold is, the wages aren't being paid, and should companies stop betting on these events right now? Quite often if we hear that there is a team in financial trouble, we'll suspend betting on them just from a protective perspective. But we can't always be aware this is happening. And in certain other sports, such as say golf, for example, players on the PGA Tour may not always get an appearance fee. They'll get paid if they make the cut. And even though these are high net worth individuals, they may go weeks on end on a bad run without making any money. It's definitely a very nuanced argument. And as I said, once you try and put these kinds of rigid structures in place into regulation, it will always throw up some kind of scenario that it can't handle and creates an awkward situation for everybody.
Gilles, what's your viewpoint on this one?
Well, you started with the example of tennis. It's clear that the prize money, I think one of the remarks from this famous report on tennis is that probably there are too many tournaments today in the world with too low prize money offered. So that's a specific issue for tennis, but probably that phenomenon can be observed in some other sports as well. And finally, in football, the issue will be different. There are so many. Let's take in Europe. There are so many countries with so many different levels and a high variety of salaries behind. Some are very low, so it's a similar issue. The point is that you have to take care of that, and what you can do to improve this has to be done. But honestly, in a second division in a small country, the economy of the sport is there. You cannot change it. It comes to the next point that was mentioned, I think, by Oliver. By the way, with the pandemic, we say this pyramid of sport you were talking about, the risks are increasing. They are stepping up in the pyramid because, as you all know, many sports, many athletes are in a very difficult financial situation now. It's going to last for months. And we know that criminal networks are going to approach more and more teams and athletes in the very near future, starting from now. And so that the risks are increasing steadily for us as well. So this is why also we have to continue to educate and have a very close, let's say, monitoring of what's happening on the market and increase very quickly the level of cooperation between all of us and with the enforcement authorities, because otherwise, with the COVID, we are going to see a lot of cases. We are all going to lose money, by the way.
Yes. Is this in a large part, obviously, the corruption exists and thrives in the situation where there's not any visibility on what's happening, and I do wonder: is there a that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant in this sense, and therefore should there be greater cooperation and more attempt at trying to understand where each link in the chain, how it works, how they interact? Maybe Gustav, you could talk about that.
Well, that is my key point in my advocacy, that we are almost blind if we are not allowed to monitor what is going on, and that's the main reason why it's so crucial that operators with a local license are allowed to have a wide offer to the punters, and of course they shall be obliged by law to not just cooperate but to inform law enforcement whenever they find anything suspicious. I am, as I said previously, concerned about the channelization level in my own jurisdiction as well as in other jurisdictions. One reason why I'm so concerned is obviously that what happens outside the national license system is so much more difficult to monitor and to cooperate with. And let me also give you perhaps another perspective of that, namely that the unlicensed operators outside, in my case, the Swedish licensing system, they of course also offer bets in big teams, high tiers, and for that reason, they obviously work as a one-stop shop for the punters. So there is a demand for low-tier bets. It may not be huge, but there is a demand. And when the punter wants to place that bet, she or he goes to an unlicensed operator and plays perhaps a small bet on a tier 4 football game in Sweden. What happens then is that she or he notices that she can also place her other bets on that unlicensed operators. And since, well, I represent the licensed operators, maybe I shouldn't give this kind of advice, but often the unlicensed operators also offer a better return to player since they don't pay any tax. And they also offer all kinds of bonuses and incentives for the consumers to stay with them. So the incentive or the possibility for me as a representative for the licensed gambling market, or the possibility for the state to convince the punter whenever she or he has left the licensed market, is almost impossible, and therefore it is so crucial that we protect and maintain a high channelization in the national licensed market, and we do so by allowing generosity when it comes to what the licensed operators may offer.
Okay, that's great. We're within a minute of finishing, so there's time for some closing remarks. Maybe, Oliver, if you could just say, what do you think that the bookies will be doing in the next 6 months in terms of warning or guarding against corruption? What kind of checks? Will there be extra checks in place because of what's happened in the last 6 months?
Yeah, I think a lot of bookies, I mean, across the world, have learned a lot over the last 6 months around how to handle betting in pandemics. Obviously, over the first few months, we had our offering reduced down to just table tennis, esports, and a bit of darts, I guess, would be the key ones. Sports that we'd always would have offered, but never would have been the core of our offering. But we certainly learned a lot around, which players to offer, which ones to not. There was a lot of very senior stakeholder involvement as well from a CSR angle of making sure that we're not scraping the barrel in terms of offering everything we can. Even said in Sweden when there were still kind of local club friendlies going on at very low level, saying that we don't need to offer these. So I think a lot of books have realised that, even if the offering is heavily reduced due to the situation, don't scrape the barrel, still put in place your procedures and keep things clean. Okay, I think that'll have to be it for now. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen. Thank you, Gilles,
Thank you, Gustav, and thank you, Oliver. And hopefully we'll see each other in person at some point in the future. So thank you very much.
Too.
We hope so, yes. Thank you.